The Red Army raised a flag over the Reichstag in May 1945, marking Hitler's empire falling in flames and rubble. But what if the real story wasn't about Soviet courage alone? Detroit, April 1944. While Captain James Harlow watches another B-24 Liberator roll off the Willow Run assembly line, Sergeant Anya Kuznetsova opens a crate marked Product of USA on the Eastern Front. In Berlin, teenage Hans Becker clutches a Panzerfaust as Allied bombs rain overhead while Martha Weiss feeds her children bread crusts in basement shelters. 3 armies converged on Berlin that spring, but only one carried the industrial might of a continent on its shoulders. The flag that flew over Hitler's ruined capital was red, but the trucks that carried it there bore American license plates. How did factories in Michigan decide the fate of the Third Reich? The answer lies buried beneath the rubble of Berlin. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The factory whistle cut through Detroit's gray morning like a blade through silk. Thousands of workers poured through the gates of Willow Run, their lunch pails swinging in rhythm with their determined steps. Captain James Harlow stood at the observation deck, watching riveters swarm over another B-24 Liberator like ants building a mechanical cathedral. The plant stretched beyond sight, assembly lines moving with clockwork precision that would have made German engineers weep. 1 bomber every 63 minutes, the plant supervisor said, wiping oil from his hands. Yesterday we delivered 18. Last month, 468. The numbers fell like hammer blows. In the time it took a German craftsman to hand-build a single Messerschmitt fighter, American workers completed nearly 24 4-engine bombers. Harlow watched the newest Liberator roll toward the test flight area, its aluminum skin gleaming under fluorescent lights. Somewhere across the Atlantic, German factories struggled to maintain pre-war production levels while American plants doubled their output monthly. The Reich's vaunted precision engineering faced an opponent it had never encountered: democracies. Assembly line. "Captain, your bird's ready for acceptance flight," a mechanic called. Harlow nodded, knowing that tomorrow this same aircraft might drop its payload on the very factories that once built Hitler's war machine. The irony wasn't lost on him. German engineering had taught the world about efficiency, but American ingenuity had weaponized abundance itself. The statistics were staggering. The United States would build 96,000 bombers before war's end, more aircraft than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Each day, American factories produced what the Axis managed in weeks. The war's outcome wasn't being decided in Normandy trenches or Pacific atolls, but here, in the rhythm of rivet guns and the thunder of rolling steel. Harlow climbed into the cockpit, engines warming with mechanical perfection. Through the windscreen, he could see another dozen Liberators taking shape on the line. Somewhere across the ocean, a boy his son's age was probably being handed a Panzerfaust instead of a wrench. The thought chilled him more than the Michigan wind. Martha Weiss broke the stale bread crust into 3 pieces, each smaller than her palm. Her children watched with hollow eyes as she distributed the portions with mathematical precision. Above their basement shelter, shells thundered closer each night, and the rations grew smaller each day. "Mama, when will Papa come home?" Her youngest daughter asked, clutching a ragged doll. Martha had no answer. Her husband had vanished into the Wehrmacht's desperate reorganizations months ago, swallowed by the same military machine that now conscripted children to defend the capital. The basement. Walls shook as another bomb fell somewhere in their district. Dust rained from the ceiling, mixing with their meager dinner. Berlin's defenders included boys like Hans Becker, her 16-year-old neighbor, who had received his Volkssturm call-up that morning. When she handed him his share of bread, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from malnutrition. "They gave me this," Hans whispered, showing her a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. The single-use rocket launcher weighed more than the boy could comfortably carry. His training had lasted 2 hours. His ammunition consisted of 1 shot. "Hans, you don't have to go," Marta said, though they both knew he did. The SS shot deserters, now even children. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was reduced to arming teenagers with weapons they couldn't properly use against tanks they couldn't hope to stop. Outside, the city starved. Daily rations had fallen below 1,000 calories. Water came from wells dug in bomb craters. Mothers traded wedding rings for potato peels. The vaunted German efficiency had collapsed into chaos. Logistics strangled by constant bombardment. Hans stood to leave, tucking the bread crust into his jacket pocket. "Thank you, Frau Weiss. Maybe when this is over, we can have real meals again?" The optimism in his voice broke her heart. Real meals required supply lines, and supply lines required fuel, and fuel required refineries that American bombers had systematically destroyed. Through the basement window, Marta could see searchlights sweeping the sky, hunting for Allied aircraft. The irony was bitter. Germany had perfected the science of war, but America had perfected the industry of victory. Each bomb that fell echoed first from a factory floor across the Atlantic. The Reich's children now carried weapons designed for desperation, while Allied soldiers advanced with equipment built by abundance. Hans disappeared into the smoky night, another name destined for the casualty lists. Marta pulled her daughters closer, listening to the artillery grow louder. Above them, the Reich's final hours played out in thunder and flame. In the morning, she would learn that Hans's position had been overrun. The Panzerfaust had misfired. Another teenager lost to a war decided not by courage but by production statistics. Sergeant Anya Kuznetsova checked her rifle as the briefing officer spread maps across the table. The Oder River stretched before them, the last barrier before Berlin. Behind her, Soviet divisions prepared for the final assault, their ranks filled with veterans who had marched from Stalingrad. But their boots told a different story than their flags. "Comrades, tomorrow we storm the fascist capital," the colonel announced. "Our glorious Red Army will plant the banner of socialism over Hitler's bunker." The words rang with revolutionary fervor, but Anya noticed the officer's uniform bore American-made buttons. Even the paper for their maps came from Lend-Lease shipments. Her squad leader distributed ammunition, each clip wrapped in packaging marked "Product of USA." The irony wasn't lost on the soldiers. They fought for Stalin's glory, but Americanist factories kept them fed, clothed, and mobile. Without those shipments, their advance would have stalled at the Volga. "Look at this," whispered Private Volkov, opening a crate of supplies. Inside lay canned meat, chocolate bars, and cigarettes, all bearing English labels, American beef for Russian stomachs. The joke had grown stale during their westward march, but the reality remained stark. Every meal brought them closer to Berlin, and every meal came from across the Atlantic. The statistics were staggering. America had shipped 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, enough to motorize entire armies. 13,000 locomotives pulled Soviet supply trains on American-built rails. Nearly 3 million tons of petroleum fueled their tanks and aircraft. The Red Army that prepared to storm Berlin rode on American wheels and burned American gasoline. Anya examined her equipment. Her helmet was Soviet steel. Her rifle bore Tula markings, but her boots came from Massachusetts factories. The contradiction embodied their entire war effort. Russian blood and American leather marched together toward Hitler's doorstep. "The fascists think we're primitive peasants," the colonel continued. "They don't understand that the workers of the world have united against their tyranny." But the workers he referenced included Detroit auto workers and Pittsburgh steel workers who had never seen a collective farm. Global Solidarity had an American postal code. Through the tent flaps, Anya could see endless columns of trucks carrying supplies forward. Studebakers, Dodges, Fords. The names meant nothing to Soviet soldiers, but the vehicles meant everything. Without them, ammunition wouldn't reach the front, wounded couldn't reach hospitals, and reinforcements couldn't reach the battle. The briefing ended with traditional revolutionary songs, but the melody was accompanied by the rumble of American engines. Tomorrow they would cross the Oder and begin the assault that would end the war. Their orders were written in Cyrillic, but their success depended on English-speaking factory workers who had never seen the Kremlin. Anya loaded her rifle and checked her pack. Inside, next to her mess kit and personal items, lay a photograph of her family and a bar of American chocolate she was saving for victory. The flag they would plant over the Reichstag would be red, but the trucks that carried them there bore foreign nameplates. History would remember the Soviet triumph, but the fuel in their engines burned American. Captain James Harlow climbed into his B-24 Liberator as dawn mist lifted from the Italian airfield. The engines rumbled to life with the same mechanical rhythm he had witnessed on the Willow Run assembly line, each cylinder firing with precision that German engineers could admire, but no longer match. Today's target lay deep in occupied territory, the synthetic fuel plants that kept the Wehrmacht moving. The briefing had been clinical in its efficiency. Intelligence photographs showed sprawling industrial complexes, their smokestacks reaching toward gray skies like concrete fingers. Each facility represented years of German investment, billions of marks in infrastructure, and the Reich's desperate attempt to replace resources they could no longer import. American bombs would reduce those investments to twisted metal in minutes. "Formation's tight, boys," Harlow called through the intercom as 18 Liberators lifted into formation. Behind them, more squadrons rose from airfields across Italy, while other groups launched from England. The sky filled with aluminum and steel, a metallic cloud moving east with devastating purpose. The statistics told the war's true story. American factories had produced 2.7 million tons of bombs, more explosive power than the Reich had ever possessed. German aircraft losses exceeded 30,000, while American production lines delivered replacements faster than crews could be trained. The Luftwaffe fought with what they had. The United States fought with what they could build. Crossing the Alps, Harlow watched the landscape unfold below. Somewhere down there, German commanders studied intelligence reports showing impossible American production figures. They calculated tonnage dropped, sorties flown, and aircraft lost, arriving at conclusions that defied their understanding of industrial capacity. How could a democracy outproduce a militarized state? The answer lay in the fundamental difference between systems. German factories operated under rigid state control, their output limited by bureaucratic efficiency and resource scarcity. American plants ran on competitive abundance, each company striving to exceed their rivals' production records. Ford didn't just build bombers to defeat Hitler, they built them to prove they could build them faster than anyone else. "Target in sight," the bombardier announced. Below, the synthetic fuel complex sprawled across several acres, its geometric precision a testament to German engineering. Chemical towers rose like a mechanical forest, pipes snaking between processing units with mathematical elegance. It was beautiful, efficient, and doomed. The bomb bay doors opened with mechanical precision. Harlow held the aircraft steady as 500 pounds of high explosive fell toward the target. Around him, 17 other aircraft released their loads simultaneously. In 30 seconds, they would erase what had taken 3 years to build. The explosions bloomed like deadly flowers, each blast representing months of German fuel production lost forever. Smokestacks toppled, processing units crumpled, and chemical storage tanks erupted in spectacular fireballs. The Reich's energy independence died in fire and thunder. Banking for home, Harlow watched smoke rise from the ruins. Tomorrow, German bus tank commanders would receive smaller fuel allocations. Next week, Luftwaffe squadrons would be grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Each bomb that fell on Reich infrastructure echoed first from an American factory floor, carried by American crews, dropped from American aircraft built with American abundance. Hans Becker crouched in the rubble of what had been a school playground, his Panzerfaust weighing heavy in his thin arms. The weapon was longer than he was tall, designed for men with military training, not 16-year-old boys with 2 hours of instruction. Around him, other Volkssturm conscripts huddled in makeshift positions, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of chronic malnutrition. The thunder from the east grew louder each hour. Soviet artillery pounded German positions with methodical precision, each shell representing industrial capacity that the Reich could no longer match. Hans had heard the statistics whispered in breadlines. The Red Army possessed more artillery pieces than Germany had ever manufactured. They fired more shells in a single barrage than German factories produced in a month. "Remember, boys, aim for the tracks," their squad leader instructed, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The man was barely 30, but looked 50, worn down by months of impossible orders and dwindling supplies. 1 shot, 1 tank. Make it count. The mathematics were brutal. Each Panzerfaust cost more to manufacture than most German families earned in a year, yet they were being handed to children who had never seen real combat. Hans examined his weapon with the desperate intensity of the doomed. The instruction manual was 2 pages long, illustrated with simple drawings that assumed basic literacy. The trigger mechanism felt fragile in his hands, a single-use device that represented Germany's entire tactical philosophy, one desperate shot at overwhelming odds. Through the broken schoolyard fence, he could see the city's transformation. Berlin, once the proud capital of European civilization, had become a landscape of craters and twisted metal. Allied bombing had reduced whole districts to rubble fields where survivors scavenged for anything useful. The vaunted German efficiency had collapsed into chaos. The irony was heartbreaking. German engineering had spent decades perfecting precision manufacturing, creating weapons and vehicles renowned for their quality and reliability. But precision required time, resources, and skilled workers, luxuries that the Reich no longer possessed. American factories built adequate equipment quickly, while German workshops struggled to maintain perfection slowly. Hans heard the rumble of approaching armor. Somewhere beyond the smoke, Soviet tanks advanced with mechanical inevitability. His single shot would face vehicles built in factories powered by American resources, crewed by soldiers fed with American provisions, supported by logistics networks running on American trucks. The weight of the Panzerfaust cut into his shoulder. 1 shot, against an army supplied by the world's most productive industrial base. Against tanks that could be replaced faster than German factories could build their single-use destroyers. Against soldiers who ate meat while German defenders chewed bread crusts, a T-34 appeared through the smoke, its steel flanks scarred by previous encounters. Hans raised his weapon, hands trembling not from fear but from weeks of insufficient food. The mathematical precision of German engineering faced the brutal arithmetic of American abundance. 1 shot against inexhaustible replacement. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The rocket streaked toward its target, carrying with it the desperation of a collapsing empire. When Hans opened his eyes, the tank still moved forward, its armor barely scratched. His war ended in the thunder of return fire. Sergeant Anya Kuznetsova tore open another crate marked "Product of USA," revealing canned peaches that gleamed like golden treasures under the gray Soviet sky. Her squad gathered around as she distributed the American provisions, each soldier receiving portions that exceeded their official rations. The irony never escaped them. They advanced toward Berlin on full stomachs provided by capitalist factories. Americans. "Peaches for Russian heroes," joked Private Volkov, opening his can with a bayonet tip. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after months of field rations and captured German supplies. Around them, the artillery continued its methodical bombardment, each shell fired from guns transported on American trucks, aimed by observers using American radio equipment. The logistics were staggering. 5 million tons of food had crossed the Atlantic to sustain Soviet operations. 12 million pairs of boots kept Red Army soldiers marching westward. 51,000 jeeps carried commanders and supplies across terrain where horse-drawn wagons had once been the primary transport. The revolution that Lenin had promised was being delivered by Detroit assembly lines. Anya examined her equipment with new understanding. Her rifle was Soviet-manufactured, her uniform bore Red Army insignia, but her boots came from Massachusetts, her ammunition belt from Ohio factories, and her field rations from Iowa canneries. The global workers' revolution had an American return address. "Look at this," Volkov said, pulling labels from supply crates. "Ford Motor Company, General Electric, United States Steel Corporation." The names meant nothing to Soviet soldiers, but the products meant everything. Without them, their advance would have stalled somewhere between Moscow and Warsaw. The political commissar distributed news from home, reading reports about heroic Soviet production increases and revolutionary fervor. But the soldiers knew the truth. Their tanks burned American gasoline, their trucks carried American spare parts, and their stomachs digested American calories. The great patriotic war was being fought with international abundance. Through the supply tent's entrance, Anya watched endless convoys rolling toward Berlin. Studebaker trucks carried ammunition, Dodge vehicles transported wounded soldiers, and Ford engines powered everything from generators to water pumps. The mechanized might of the Red Army bore foreign nameplates at every level. The mathematics were undeniable. American Lend-Lease shipments represented more industrial capacity than the Soviet Union had possessed before the war began. The United States had essentially supplied two armies, their own forces advancing from the west and Soviet forces pushing from the east. German commanders faced not just military opponents, but the combined productive capacity of two continents. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Tomorrow we cross the Oder," Anya told her squad. "Final assault on the fascist capital." The words carried revolutionary weight, but the meal they shared beforehand came from American farms. The boots they would wear belonged to Massachusetts factories. The trucks that would carry them forward bore Detroit serial numbers. She tucked a chocolate bar into her pack, saving it for the moment when they reached the Reichstag. The flag they would plant would be red, but the fuel that carried them there was refined in Texas. History would remember Soviet courage, but the foundation of their advance was built in American factories by workers who had never seen the Kremlin. Each mouthful of American food brought them closer to Berlin, closer to victory, closer to a triumph that belonged as much to Detroit as to Moscow. The sky above Berlin turned orange as Captain James Harlow's squadron approached through scattered clouds. Below, the city stretched in all directions, its geometric precision now interrupted by bomb craters and collapsed buildings. This was the heart of the Reich, the capital that Hitler had promised would stand for 1,000 years. American bombers had been systematically reducing that promise to rubble for the past 18 months. Marta Weiss pressed her children against the basement wall as the air raid sirens wailed their familiar warning. Above them, the thunder of aircraft engines grew louder, a mechanical storm that had become Berlin's nightly symphony. She counted the sounds. Dozens of planes, maybe hundreds. Each engine represented American industrial capacity that the Reich could no longer match. "Formation tight, boys," Harlow called through the intercom. "Target is the rail yards east of the city center. Intelligence says they're still moving supplies through there." His bombardier studied the target photographs, noting the geometric patterns of tracks and switching stations that kept the Wehrmacht supplied. Today, those patterns would become chaos. Through her basement window, Marta could see searchlights, sweeping the sky like desperate fingers grasping for salvation. German anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, their shells bursting in ineffective clusters. The Luftwaffe that had once dominated European skies now consisted of a handful of aircraft hidden in dispersed bases, grounded by fuel shortages and pilot losses. The statistics told the story of systematic destruction. Berlin had been bombed 363 times since Allied operations began. 80% of the city center lay in ruins. The transportation networks that had once moved German armies across Europe now struggled to deliver bread to their own capital. American bombs had created a logistical desert in the heart of the Reich. "Bomb bay doors open," the bombardier announced. Harlow held the aircraft steady as 500 pounds of high explosive prepared to fall toward the rail complex below. Around him, 17 other liberators prepared to release their loads simultaneously. In the time it took to cross the target, they would drop more explosive power than German factories produced in a week. Marta hugged her daughters as the bombs fell. The explosions shook their basement shelter like an earthquake, dust raining from the ceiling with each impact. Through the chaos, she could hear the systematic destruction of her city's infrastructure. Rails twisted into metal sculptures, switching stations collapsed into geometric puzzles, and supply warehouses erupted. In spectacular fireballs, the bombing was precisely coordinated with Soviet ground operations. As American aircraft destroyed German supply lines from above, Red Army artillery pounded defensive positions from the east. The Reich faced enemies approaching from opposite directions, their attacks synchronized by radio communications that spanned continents. Banking for home, Harlow watched smoke rise from the target area. Tomorrow, Wehrmacht units would receive smaller ammunition allocations. Next week, German commanders would abandon positions they could no longer supply. Each bomb that fell represented American industrial might translate it into battlefield advantage. For Marta, the war came from above before it came from the east. The thunder overhead carried the echo of Detroit assembly lines, the rhythm of Pennsylvania, steel mills, and the determination of a democracy that had weaponized its abundance. When the all-clear sounded hours later, she emerged to find her neighborhood transformed once again into a landscape of twisted metal and broken stone. Sergeant Anya Kuznetsova advanced through the smoke-filled streets of Berlin, her boots crunching on broken glass and scattered brick. The Reichstag dome loomed ahead through the haze, its stone facade pockmarked by shell impacts, but still standing defiantly against the gray sky. Around her, Soviet soldiers moved with grim determination through the urban maze that had once been the proud capital of European fascism. Machine gun fire chattered from upper-story windows as Wehrmacht defenders made their final stand. Anya pressed against a collapsed wall, feeling the masonry shake with each burst. Her squad had advanced 3 blocks since dawn, paying for each meter with blood and ammunition. The cost of urban warfare was measured in casualties that would have horrified peacetime armies. "Grenade!" someone shouted. The explosion sent more debris raining down as Soviet engineers cleared another strong point. Behind them, artillery fire continued its methodical bombardment, each shell representing the industrial capacity that had carried them from the Volga to Hitler's doorstep. The guns that fired those shells had been transported on American trucks, their crews fed with American provisions. Through the smoke, Anya could see other Soviet units converging on the government district. Tank columns rumbled down wider avenues, their steel flanks scarred by weeks of urban combat. Many of those tanks burned American gasoline, their crews sustained by American rations. The Red Army that assaulted Berlin carried Russian flags, but ran on capitalist fuel. The human cost was staggering. 80,000 Soviet soldiers would die in the Battle of Berlin, their lives the final payment for victory over fascism. 2,000 tanks would be destroyed in the urban maze, their twisted wreckage joining the landscape of destruction that modern warfare demanded. Each death was mourned, each tank loss calculated, but the replacements kept coming. "Forward, comrades!" the political commissar called, raising his pistol toward the Reichstag. "History awaits our banner." The words carried revolutionary fervor, but the advance was sustained by American logistics. The boots that carried Soviet soldiers forward were manufactured in Massachusetts. The ammunition that filled their rifles came from Ohio factories. The medical supplies that treated their wounded originated in Detroit pharmaceutical plants. A German Panzerfaust streaked from a nearby building, its rocket trail marking another desperate attempt at resistance. The projectile struck a Soviet tank, sending flames shooting skyward. But the tank that died was quickly replaced by another, and another after that. American production lines could build replacements faster than German desperation could destroy. Vim. Anya reached the Reichstag steps as afternoon shadows lengthened across the battle-scarred plaza. The building that had housed Hitler's government now stood like a broken monument to fascist ambition. Tomorrow, a Soviet flag would fly from its dome, marking the end of the war in Europe. But the victory belonged as much to American factories as to Russian courage. The irony was complete. Stalin's revolution had triumphed over Hitler's empire, but the triumph was delivered by capitalist industry. The flag that would soon fly over the Reichstag was red, but the trucks that carried it, there bore foreign nameplates. Through the smoke and rubble, Anya could see history's final prize waiting for her comrades to claim. Hans Becker crouched behind the remnants of a park bench, his hands shaking as he gripped the Panzerfaust that weighed nearly as much as he did. The weapons instruction manual lay torn at his feet, its simple diagrams now meaningless in the chaos of approaching armor. Through the smoke that had become Berlin's permanent atmosphere, he could hear the rumble of Soviet tanks growing closer with mechanical inevitability. His squad consisted of 6 other teenagers and 2 men over 50, all that remained of the Volkssturm unit that had mustered 48 hours earlier. The others had vanished into the urban maze of rubble and flame, some fallen to enemy fire, others simply disappeared into the anonymous tragedy of collapsing empires. Hans was alone with his fear and his single shot at redemption. The T-34 appeared, through the smoke like a steel nightmare, its cannon swiveling to target suspected resistance positions. The tank's scarred armor told the story of its westward journey from the Volga, each dent and burn mark representing a battle survived on its march toward Hitler's capital. Behind it, Hans could see infantry moving in tactical formation, their discipline contrasting sharply with his own desperate improvisation. He raised the Panzerfaust with trembling arms, trying to remember the brief instruction he had received. "Aim for the tracks," the sergeant had said. "One shot, one tank." But the mathematics were brutal. His single projectile faced an enemy supported by unlimited replacement capacity. American factories could build tanks faster than German desperation could destroy them. The trigger felt fragile. Under his finger, a mechanism designed for trained soldiers rather than malnourished teenagers. Through the weapon's simple sight, he could see Soviet infantry advancing behind their armor, their movements coordinated by radio communications. That spanned continents. They carried American rifles, wore American boots, and advanced with American-supplied confidence. Hans thought of his mother, probably huddled in some basement shelter, listening to the artillery grow closer. He thought of his father, lost somewhere in the Wehrmacht's desperate reorganizations, swallowed by a military machine that now conscripted children to defend what adults could no longer hold. He thought of the chocolate bars he had seen American soldiers hand out in captured footage, abundance that seemed mythical to Berlin's starving defenders. The tank's engine noise grew deafening. Hans closed his eyes and pulled the trigger, feeling the weapon kick against his shoulder like an angry animal. The rocket streaked toward its target, carrying with it the desperate mathematics of asymmetric warfare. One shot against inexhaustible replacement, German precision against American abundance. When he opened his eyes, the tank still moved forward, its armor barely scratched by his projectile. The return fire came immediately, a high explosive shell that turned his hiding place into flying fragments of stone and metal. Hans Becker vanished into the statistics of urban warfare, another name lost in the casualty reports that documented Empire's end. Behind the advancing armor, Soviet soldiers found his body among the rubble. In his pocket, they discovered a photograph of his family and a moldy crust of bread saved for later. The Panzerfaust lay twisted beside him, its single shot expended against an enemy that possessed unlimited ammunition. When the wall collapsed, Hans's war ended in dust and silence, leaving only the thunder of approaching victory. Soviet soldiers planted their banner atop the Reichstag dome as smoke swirled around the building's scarred facade. The red flag snapped. In the wind above Berlin's ruined government district, its bright fabric a stark contrast to the gray devastation that stretched in every direction. Sergeant Anya Kuznetsova watched from the plaza below as her comrades secured the building that had housed Hitler's government, their triumph marking the end of the war in Europe. The photograph would circle the globe within hours, carried by American-built radio transmitters to newspapers that would print it with American-manufactured ink. The image would show Soviet victory, but the infrastructure that transmitted it belonged to Allied communications networks spanning continents. Even the moment of triumph depended on capitalist technology. "We did it, comrade," Private Volkov said, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. Around them, Soviet soldiers moved through the Reichstag's halls, securing rooms where Nazi officials had planned their empire's expansion. The irony was bitter. Stalin's revolution had conquered Hitler's Reich, but the conquest was delivered by American logistics. The human cost had been staggering. 100,000 Red Army casualties for the Reichstag operation alone. Half of Berlin's buildings lay in ruins, their debris forming geometric patterns of destruction that would take decades to clear. The victory was real, the sacrifice genuine, but the foundation was foreign-built. Anya examined her equipment one final time. Her rifle bore Soviet markings, her uniform carried Red Army insignia, but her boots came from Massachusetts factories. The ammunition in her belt originated in Ohio plants. The medical kit in her pack contained supplies manufactured in Detroit. The global workers' revolution had been delivered by American assembly lines. Through the Reichstag's broken windows, she could see other Soviet units securing the government district. Tank columns rumbled through wider avenues, their steel flanks bearing the scars of urban combat. Many of those tanks burned American gasoline, their crews sustained by American rations, their replacement parts manufactured in American factories. The political commissar gathered the survivors for a brief ceremony. "Comrades, today we have planted the banner of socialism over the fascist capital. The great patriotic war is ended, the workers of the world united in victory." The words carried revolutionary weight, but the boots that carried Soviet soldiers stood on American souls. The flag flew red above the conquered capital, its crimson fabric marking the triumph of Soviet arms over Nazi ambition. But the trucks that had carried those arms to Berlin bore foreign nameplates. The fuel that powered their advance was refined in Texas. The food that sustained their soldiers came from Iowa farms. The weapons that secured their victory were built with American steel. Standing in the plaza below the conquered Reichstag, Anya understood the mathematical reality of modern warfare. Industrial capacity had trumped military tradition. Democratic abundance had overwhelmed totalitarian efficiency. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years had been crushed by an opponent it had never understood, the productive power of free peoples determined to remain free. The banner that flew over Hitler's ruined capital was red, but the engines that brought it there roared American. Victory belonged to all who had fought fascism, but the foundation of that victory was built in the factories of a democracy that had weaponized its abundance. Captain James Harlow stood on the observation deck of a liberated airfield, watching columns of smoke rise from Berlin's government district. His B-24 Liberator sat nearby, its aluminum skin reflecting the orange glow of fires that marked the end of the Third Reich. Around him, other American air crews prepared for missions that would no longer target enemy positions, but would instead deliver humanitarian supplies to conquered territories. The statistics were overwhelming in their finality. American factories had produced 300,000 aircraft during the war, more flying machines than had existed in the entire world before 1939. 50,000 tanks had rolled from assembly lines that had once built automobiles. 71,000 ships had carried American production to every theater of conflict. The numbers told the story of democracy's arsenal, overwhelming totalitarian ambition. Harlow reviewed the mission reports stacked on his desk, each document representing systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. Oil refineries reduced to twisted metal, aircraft factories bombed into rubble, transportation networks severed by precision strikes. The Reich's ability to wage war had been methodically dismantled by American engineering applied to the science of destruction. "Sir, intelligence reports the Reichstag has fallen," his aide announced. "Soviet forces have secured the government district." The news carried across Allied command networks with electronic speed, transmitted by radio systems that connected American commanders with British intelligence and Soviet field commanders. Even the communication of victory depended on American technology. The strategic implications were staggering. Germany had possessed some of the world's most advanced military technology: jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, sophisticated radar systems. But technology meant nothing without the industrial capacity to produce it in decisive quantities. American factories had overwhelmed German innovation with sheer productive abundance. Harlow thought about the Willow Run plant where his aircraft had been born. While German engineers perfected their designs, American workers had perfected their production. While the Reich built craft masterpieces, America built adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers. The war had been won not by superior weapons, but by superior manufacturing. The mathematics of American victory were undeniable. 17.5 million tons of supplies delivered through Lend-Lease programs. Equipment provided to 61 nations fighting fascism. Industrial capacity that had doubled during the war while enemy production collapsed under bombing. Democracy's arsenal had proven more powerful than any military tradition. "Captain, what do you think made the difference?" his aide asked, studying intelligence photographs of Berlin's destruction. Harlow considered the question carefully. Superior strategy, Allied cooperation, Soviet sacrifice. All were important, but the foundation was simpler. Free peoples outproduced slave labor because freedom worked more efficiently than oppression. The sun set over Germany's conquered capital, its light reflecting off the wings of American aircraft that had carried democracy's message across an ocean. In every ruined German city lay the shadow of American steel. Behind every fallen Nazi position stood the outline of an American factory. The Third Reich had been overwhelmed not by military genius, but by the productive capacity of a nation that understood the mathematics of modern war. Harlow climbed into his aircraft for what might be his final combat mission. Tomorrow, these bombers would carry food instead of explosives, medicine instead of destruction. The arsenal of democracy was transforming into the mechanism of recovery, but the lesson remained clear. Free peoples, properly equipped and determined, could overcome any tyranny. Marta Weiss emerged from her basement shelter to find American soldiers distributing chocolate bars to children on Berlin's rubble-strewn streets. The contrast was startling. Weeks earlier, these same uniforms had belonged to enemies dropping bombs from unreachable heights. Now they handed out candy with the casual abundance that had characterized everything about the American war effort. Her daughters stared at the chocolate with wonder, having forgotten that such luxuries existed. The wrapper bore English text and colorful graphics that seemed impossibly bright against the gray backdrop of urban destruction. One soldier noticed their hesitation and smiled, pressing additional bars into their small hands with generous gestures that spoke louder than language barriers. "For you, Fräulein," the GI said in broken German, offering Marta a can of preserved meat. The metal container felt substantial in her hands, its weight representing more nutrition than her family had consumed in the past month. The label read, "Product of USA?" In familiar text she had seen on supply crates throughout the city. American abundance was feeding both conquest and recovery. Around them, other civilians emerged from shelters and basements, blinking in sunlight that revealed the true scope of Berlin's transformation. The city that had been the proud capital of European fascism now resembled an archaeological site, its streets filled with rubble that would take decades to clear. Yet already, American efficiency was organizing the chaos. Military engineers surveyed water systems and power grids, their clipboards filled with plans for reconstruction. Logistics officers calculated supply requirements with the same methodical precision that had delivered victory. Medical teams established aid stations in buildings that had survived the bombing, the same organizational capacity that had overwhelmed. The Reich was now rebuilding what it had destroyed. The irony was complete. German efficiency had been a source of national pride for generations, a cultural characteristic that had made in Germany a symbol of quality and precision. But American abundance had proven more powerful than German perfectionism. Massy production had trumped craft manufacturing. Democratic competition had outperformed totalitarian control. Marta watched her daughters share chocolate with other children, their laughter the first joyful sound she had heard in months. The soldiers who provided these simple treasures carried equipment that told the story of industrial democracy. Their rifles, vehicles, radios, and medical supplies all bore the markings of different American companies competing to supply their military. The transformation was already beginning. Food distribution centers replaced bombing targets. Medical stations occupied buildings that had housed Nazi administration. Communication networks that had coordinated destruction now organized recovery. The productive capacity that had won, the war was transitioning to win the peace. Standing among Berlin's ruins, Marta understood the mathematical reality that had decided her nation's fate. The Reich had possessed technical excellence, military tradition, and ideological fervor. But ideology couldn't manufacture ammunition, tradition couldn't build aircraft, and excellence meant nothing without the industrial base to support it. American democracy had weaponized abundance itself. The chocolate her daughters consumed came from factories that had never stopped production, supplied by farms that had never known invasion, transported by ships that had crossed oceans in safety. Freedom's flag was stitched not only in blood, but in steel, oil, and the hands of free people who built faster than tyranny could destroy. If you enjoyed the story I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.